Welcome to Syntax. We are in the 900s, 901.
Hey!
Yes. I guess if we did zero-based indexing and normal-based counting, 900 was officially entering the 900s, but we're past that barrier now, 100. And guess what? There's been a massive amount of JavaScript news just a little bit ago. There's been all kinds of new updates to both React, Svelte, and all kinds of stuff. So we're going to be talking about what's been going on in the web dev world, from new React APIs to new Svelte APIs, React Server components, Redwood JS, Storybook, and more. So, as always, my name is Scott Tolinsky, and with me, as always, is Wes Boss. What's up, Wes?
Yeah, it's so funny because the React Server component stuff. So we did a show saying, like, where are we at with React Server components? And we recorded it and went off. And like before it dropped, there was two major updates to React Server components, which quite honestly shakes up the whole story of not a ton of people supporting it. And it's just like, that always happens to us. Same with the payment episode. We were talking about Stripe, and like 2 days before the payment episode dropped, they announced that now they charge you when somebody, regardless of if you win a chargeback or not, they're still charging you $15, which is ridiculous. So there's always something new that pops up, which is we try to record them like a week and ahead advance. It's not too far, but there's always something new popping up.
Yeah, it's nonstop. And I just heard about another like payment system that I hadn't really heard about. It functions along the lines of like Lemon Squeezy or whatever, where you are like Lemon Squeezy is the merchant of record. Yeah. I can even find it. Polar. Have you heard of Polar?
Polar?
Yeah, .sh. Polar.sh.
I believe I did see this, which is a payment infrastructure for the 21st century, the modern way to sell your SaaS and digital products. All right, what's the pricing? Immediately, 4% plus 40 cents per transaction. Immediately, I am out.
Yeah.
That's the problem with a lot of these things is you're not going to get any cheaper than Stripe unless somebody literally builds another payment processor.
I think the benefit here is strictly that they are the merchant of record, right? You know, like that is the sell there. It's like, yes, you're paying, and now you don't have to deal with all kinds of complications.
Well, Lemon Squeezy went up to like 10% or something like that. So I guess if you're looking for that, then that's a good deal.
Woof. Also, big woof if your site is not functioning well, because you have no excuses for that, especially with something like Sentry out here in the world. Sentry can make sure your app is functioning great, whether that's your cron jobs, collecting user feedback, getting alerts for all kinds of things, or even uptime monitoring, or heck, if your pages are slow or fast, you get user misery score. Or if they're buggy, you get access to all of the errors that are existing on your site. In fact, there's always going to be errors because, let's say, we're not perfect. And if you're not perfect like me, you'll want a tool like Sentry to make sure you can fix your issues. So head on over to sentry.il/syntax, sign up and get 2 months for free. Use the coupon code TASTYTREAT, all lowercase, all one word. This podcast presented by Sentry.
One more thing, real quick. May 29th, Denver, Colorado. We're doing a Syntax meetup. You got to be there if you're anywhere within a horse ride of Denver, Colorado. We got the folks from Vercel, the folks from Mux, folks from Sentry. We're all coming out, of course. We're going to have Scott there. CJ's going to be there. I'm going to be there. It's going to be a really great time. If you want to grab some tickets, they're free, but you got to get tickets. Go to syntax.fm/meetup.
All right, let's get into it with the first item on the docket today, which was React released in a blog post about experimental features in React. Now, I had heard that there was some stuff brewing on the animation side in React. It was presented as like no other framework has animation features quite like this. I don't know about that, but this is giving you a nice, smooth way of using view transitions in React, as well as another new API called Activity. So let's talk about these both. First and foremost, these are experimental, so to use them, you have to opt into React at experimental. But it brings through two new APIs for view transitions and one for rendering. So view transition is a element that will wrap I guess a component that will wrap your components to make view transitions easier within React. And then addTransitionType is a function that lets you specify the reason for a transition, just to give you a little bit more control. But if you haven't been using view transitions, they're a really well-supported browser API that allows for awesome animation features transitioning in your app. And a lot of people get this wrong where they think it's just for when you change pages, but in reality, anytime you're doing any state change on your application, you can wrap it in a view transition, and it can either interpolate that transition or you can write custom CSS to do that transition. It's just an incredible API. I love this.
It's
thing.
Kind of like a tween. You can tween between one state to another. So if you can think of, there's a lot of things in CSS you can transition from, but if you literally wanted to transition from a dog to a cat, you could. And where that's really useful is, like, you could do it with CSS grid if you're changing what the grid looks like. You can do it for sliding panels back and forth when you're not necessarily changing the URL. There's a lot you can do with it, and it's extremely powerful API. All you really have to do is just say, like, start transition, and then when the DOM is updated, the old DOM and the new DOM will just be tweened between each other, or the old element and the new element.
Big fan. The best part about this API for me is that by default, just by calling, the start transition, or in this case with React, by wrapping your components in a view transition component, just by doing that bit, you get a really basic fade animation, which honestly is like such a great default functionality, just to have a basic fade animation as being the default. You don't even have to write anything other than, hey, do this transition, and you get a fade. And then to get that tween, you do need to give your transition a name, so that way it has like a name. Those are called shared element transitions, because what you're doing is you're saying, hey, this one thing on the page is the same as this one thing on this other page, even if they're not the same. But what they'll do is they'll tween between the two, and we're actually sharing our screen, so if you're watching on video, you can see exactly how that looks within this animation and how you're able to do that. In this React API, you're specifying a name with a unique identifier that's the same as a name with a unique identifier on the other page or element. And in HTML, CSS land, this is done with CSS property. In this API, it's being done with a prop on the view transition.
Important to note as well that in order to trigger these, it doesn't just trigger on any update. You do have to fire off either a start transition, use deferred value, or a suspense that's resolving. So if you have a suspended component that's showing like a loader state, and then it resolves, it will transition between the two of those. So it's kind of nice. I like that React seems to be putting a lot of these things in as first party implementations, because that means that you don't have to bring in some plugin for it. But it also means that if you're using a third-party component, those components can fire off transitions. And then if you want to take advantage of those components that are transitioning, then you can just wrap it in a view transition yourself. So I hope that this lands in stable, but certainly go and try it for your application right now so we can get feedback on what the API looks like.
Yeah, and it's neat too. There's also this addTransitionType function, which we mentioned, where you can then basically say this transition is like their example that they have here is like, let's say you navigate forward or navigate back. That way you can have like on iOS, when you click into something, it like moves over to the one side on in and then moves over to the other side on out, right? Because you're then able to specify a specific animation for navigating forward or navigating backwards, because you've now given that a name, and then you can write your custom CSS for each of those animations, which is really great to have. That's a nice thing to have because it is always kind of weird when you have just like the same animation on in and out, especially if that animation is like, let's zoom in. And now you're like, let's zoom in again on the way out, So it's always important to know like that feels kind of natural in the way you're doing it. Now, the one thing I want to say is that the reason why this is necessary, if you're wondering why, it's mostly because of the virtual DOM, right? Is that like why these are needed? Because in most of the DOM forward frameworks, you just use the straight up JavaScript. Is that accurate to say that, you think?
I don't think so.
You think these are just helpers, really? You
want to be able to specify the direction and name what is happening. Because like go to the syntax.fm and show the number that gets bigger and smaller as you click through.
Well, that's what's it called? That's a shared element transition, those will always work forward and backwards no matter what.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's necessarily I don't think it is something to do with the virtual DOM. Maybe it is. We'll have to play with it.
Yeah. I know it's one of those things where my apologies, folks. My React is a little rusty, but I am stoked that these are in here specifically because this isn't going to add a ton of JavaScript to your app to do these transitions. You're not having to add a library to do the interpolation between your elements. That's all being handled by the browser. The amount of code here is simply just the wrapping elements and the functions that you need here rather than anything to handle the animations themselves, which we gotta love. The next API that they introduced in this experimental release here is the Activity API. It's another component, and Activity is kind of interesting because what it does is it basically allows you to pre-render a component without having it be visible. And it's interesting that there is a non-Boolean flag for this, which David K. Piano got to be very stoked about this. He hates Boolean APIs. So it's basically an activity element with a mode prop, and that mode prop can either accept a visible or a hidden value, where visible allows it to be just rendered as normally, where hidden is going to keep the component unmounted, but save its state and continue to render at a lower priority than anything visible on the screen. Basically, it's preheating your elements for you, so that way if you have already loaded it, then it like kind of stays loaded, or if you are going to load it, then that way it's going to like make that transition for when it actually shows up to be very fast. So it says that you can use the activity to save parts of the UI that the user isn't using, or pre-render parts that a user is likely to use next.
Yeah, that, for example, like maybe we should say, like, why would you possibly ever want this? So if you have like tabs and you want to be able to hide and show content, you kind of have two options. First, you can just not render them. And then when somebody clicks a button, you can go ahead and render those. And then the other option is you can simply just hide them with CSS. And that might also not be what you want. You might want to be, is if you're hiding them with CSS, you may not be getting all of the benefits. And you also are firing off things like effects, which you might not want, because you want your effect to run when the component is mounted, right? But if you're pre-rendering it, should it also run the effect? Maybe not. Depends, right? If you're like auto-playing some video, you probably don't want that.
Well, this says it does not, by the way. The activity...
Yes, it does not,
it does not
do that type of thing. So this is the ability to, like, I guess, a third way to get in there. Mm-hmm. And it also is more performant. So I guess React will figure out, it will deprioritize the rendering. So I don't know. Like, I guess if you have something that is absolutely massive and does take quite a bit of rendering, this could certainly speed you up. But like, I don't know that I have a ton of parts in my application that are like sluggish enough that I would need to do something like this. But certainly there can be.
Here's a very practical use case here. In the React blog post, they did a really good job of kind of saying, here's a really interesting use case for this, why you might want this. So they have a listing page. On that listing page is a search box. And then there's a detail page, right? They're using the view transitions to show a detail page. These are completely separate components. So this is a different component and this is a different component. And what you do is, let's say I type in the search bar first, and then I transition to the to the detailed page. Now, keep in mind the listing page is now unmounted, or it's not visible, right? But it is wrapped in an activity, so the state is preserved. So when I go back, the state is preserved, and the search box that's there still has the value in it.
Yeah.
So it's like maintaining that state that the user had. In my view, this is a great user experience, and like one of those things that will drive you absolutely nuts if you're using an app. Now, that said, there's tons of other ways to get by this, by one, having the search box outside of that, like in the layout.
Sucks when you have to like change it, or you have to use like an external state management that like maintains it. Yeah,
I do like external state regardless, but hey, this is not bad, and I think this will make many React apps feel nicer if people actually use it. So
totally. Plus, like, there's that benefit of you can use a component that you can npm install it, and that component doesn't necessarily need to know about what your state management is in order to maintain that type of thing. Because all of these updates are like really nice. They're just adding more features in. Same with the React Server components, is standardizing these features so that hopefully one day we get to a point where the interop between all of these third-party components will be much nicer.
Yeah, pretty sick. Big fan of this. Shout out to the React team. I think these are some great little updates here.
Kind of on the same idea here, we have a proposal in Svelte, or maybe not even a proposal. It's certainly, a lot of it has been coded as well, is the idea of asynchronous Svelte. And this is actually kind of exciting. We've talked about this quite a bit, where I've said my one gripe with Svelte is that you can't load your data at a component level. You always have to do it you always have to do it at like a page level, right? And this, I believe, I'll let Scott take it from here, as he's a bit more the Svelte guy, but this, I think, will solve that one of my main gripes with Svelte.
Yeah, it will absolutely solve that, because this isn't saying anything about Svelte Kit here. This is a Svelte API. So this is not tied to the meta framework. This is tied to the actual like front end framework. And it basically is just like, oh yeah, if you use this new version of Svelte with async enabled, you can now use the await keyword inside of the script tag at the top of a Svelte component, inside of a derived, which is just like a way to derive state from other state. In your markup in general, it's actually
await inside the template tag, which is wild.
Yes, it's wild. So this is Svelte's answer to React Suspense, to Suspense in Solid, to Suspense in View, and they're not calling it Suspense, which is fine by me, because I don't like. We already have words for suspending, like it's async await or async or whatever people on YouTube say we're saying it wrong. You know what? That's got to be one of the most confusing comments we get often is async or async. I don't even know what these people are saying. Like, which one is the right one and which is the wrong one? They're all fine. Async. It's the exact same. There's like such no difference between those two words. That's such a regional pronunciation thing. But people are like, you're saying it wrong. I'm like, what? What are you talking about?
But like, the idea here is that you can have a component that has some asynchronous work in it, whether that is something that fetches data, whether that's something that just takes a little bit of time to compute. You'll be able to wrap a boundary around those components and show a loading or pending state, right? Or a suspended state, as the rest of us would understand it.
Yeah. So I'm scrolling all over this blog post. But yes, I'm trying to find the boundary specifically. Yeah, there's a new Svelte boundary because Svelte uses boundary for like errors and things like that. But you can now use pending inside of Svelte boundary to have it when it is loading. I do find this to be really wild where you can just straight up await inside of your template tags, like await preload for an image, await on a function inside of a list item here in the template tag. It all looks nice. And I gotta say, the cool thing that I do love about this framework, and one of the reasons why I am such a diehard fanboy of this framework, is when you look at the requirements section here, the very first one, minimal ceremony. We just want to write code using the await keyword, avoid framework-specific APIs and idioms to the extent possible. I gotta tell you, when like React introduced their suspense, they had start transition, use transition, all this stuff, and I get the functionality behind that.
Yeah.
But like, there's all these names now. Like, and you have to know that transition in a start transition for suspense, not related to view transitions, which is another thing they just added. So it's like, all right, now we have view transitions, but they can be, but inherently they're not specifically. So start transition, use transition, suspense, like all these words are just there to replace words that we already had, which I don't know. It's fine. It's fine for me. But like, I like that there is minimal
Sounds
ceremony.
like it's not fine for you, Scott. It sounds like it's not. But no, I agree. I agree as well. Like there's a lot of the React stuff is like, oh, it's kind of like this, but there's some gotchas.
Yes.
And you can't do X, Y, and Z. But like Svelte is like, no, we just want to be able to put in a await inside of a component,
script tag, a component, all that stuff.
Component has a boundary around it at a higher level, then you can access that with a new pending state, and you can show if it is pending. And then there's a whole bunch of work around doing stuff concurrently, which is really important because like whenever I talk about like I just want to do my data fetching in the component, everybody comes out and says, well, that's how you get waterfalls.
Right.
Meaning that you have one component, that component loads. Oh, that component needs data. It goes off, fetches data, comes back. Oh, the data comes back. Now that needs to render another one. And then that component loads and that needs to go do something, right? And then you get these crazy waterfalls where one thing triggers another, which is why a lot of these frameworks have like sort of hard-armed us into no. Do your data fetching and loaders at a page level. So at least when you load a page, you can understand what's going on there. So they will do as much work as possible with concurrency. This, I think, in every framework, this can be a bit of a foot gun. You just have to be cognizant that you could possibly cause some performance issues with your application.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just stoked to see this in here, and I think there is some discussion whether or not they will eventually need some API for orchestrating things like start transition. So, maybe I'm speaking a little too soon on some of that stuff, but in the same regard, I think it's going to have better default, so you don't have to use those things. It does say parallel by default, since expressions in a template can be safely assumed to be pure. Sequential await expressions need not result in sequential async work. Similarly, asynchronous work in two sibling components should happen simultaneously. So, because they're a compiler, I think they can, you can just write your code as you would want to write it and not have to worry too much about that. But again, it seems like if you're deriving a value that's awaiting on a derived value, that's awaiting on a derived value, I think there's no way to avoid a waterfall in that way.
One thing I did not see in here is anything about like form actions, meaning being able to call server functions from the client. I don't know. Is that going to be something that is worked in here? Because again, right now, another thing you have to do is you have to put all of your actions at a page level, which makes no sense to me because your action is almost always tied to the component. Like, what does this thing do when it is clicked or submitted or whatever? I shouldn't have to like put that on the page where whatever page it's going to live in. I just want to be able to pop a newsletter subscription function on the component and for it to just work.
I actually agree. And it does say very specifically that like they would like to use this API to replace things like all data loading within SvelteKit. Basically, today we cannot reuse much code between server and client portions of SvelteKit. We rely on a lot of virtual models and generated code for historical reasons, but basically it's saying it's plausible. There's a lot of new interesting possibilities. We find ourselves drifting away from primitives like load, which I would assume that would also entail things like actions, considering that's the same concept of having to go to the server for data. So that's under the improving SvelteKit part of things, where basically you'd have to assume that this eventually would lead to better communication
APIs,
between the client and the server, now that we don't have to, you wouldn't be beholden necessarily to having it at a page level. So pretty dope. There's a little playground where you can go and test it out today. You can give feedback. There is a branch you can try it on, but they are... there's a lot of discussion around it, whether or not you need things like start transition, etc., etc. But pretty dope. I'm stoked for this one. Can't wait.
Next up, we have Parcel announced React Server component in beta. I knew that they were working on this, and I forgot to mention it in the React Server components, but there was really nothing that you could use. But now it's in beta. And this is kind of exciting because the thing about doing React Server components is like both your client and your server needs to know about your entire application, and you need something that can like transpile JSX and on the server. So if your server is written in Hano or Express or whatever, you need some sort of integration to that to sort of mate them together. So Parcel's released React Server component support. It's both a package you could just import on your server as well as part of the bundler. And this is pretty exciting. It's just another good example of someone that can use React Server components. I think this is going to be big for anybody that's on an existing stack that doesn't necessarily you can't move to Next.js, can't move your entire application Next.js, but you want to use React Server components. There's not a great option for that right now. So I think that this is going to really improve things.
Yeah, we had a lot of people mention Parcel with React Server components when we dropped our React Server components episode, which I've always loved Parcel. So to hear that there's been like so many people being like, Parcel, it makes me feel good. I like that. Shout out to the Parcel, Devin and those everybody at Parcel. If is there anybody else at Parcel other than Devin?
Just Devin. Devin's holding up like 80% of the React ecosystem with he's got Parcel and Lightning CSS and React Aria and all the way down.
Yeah, I love it. What a guy.
And then like a day or two later, Redwood. So Redwood is or was a kind of like a full stack framework for building applications in Node.js and React with GraphQL. So it had like an ORM, and basically all the time we're asking like, where's the Laravel for JavaScript? And everybody says, Redwood is that, right? And then it looks like they're taking a bit of a pivot away from that. I think that it's over the years, it never really got much uptake, unfortunately. And they've announced that Redwood is now Redwood GraphQL. So they've sort of moved the existing, you built your app on it, to Redwood GraphQL with all the ORM. And now Redwood SDK is being branded as a React framework for Cloudflare, which is absolutely a wild pivot and something I'm honestly quite excited about. So what it is a Vite plugin that allows you to use React Server components and form actions and all of the stuff that we know about React Server components. It allows you to use it with Vite, and it's sort of like tuned for deploying to Cloudflare. So you get tight integration with D1, which is their database. You don't have to use these things, by the way. This is just it's sort of like, I think maybe that was the problem with the original Redwood, is that they very prescriptive. And as much as we say we want things to be prescriptive, we want it to be the way that we want it. So this is just like, yes. So by default, you can get D1 and R2, which is things for like hosting like files, images, stuff like that, durable objects, queues. It has middleware, has some auth stuff built in, but it is just a Vite plugin with Wrangler installed by default. And then the Vite plugin is probably the most impressive part, because doing React server components with Vite is not easy. I think Waku is the only other one at the time that does this.
Waku.
So this is kind of exciting. Waku. I can't say it wrong every single time.
Async, Waku, Waku. Yeah.
So this is cool. I think I don't know. I think it's an interesting pivot, and it's also just like another huge win for Vite as well.
How many wins can they stack up for real?
Publishing React to Cloudflare is getting easier and easier, because like I've gone through the whole gamut of it, right? I did Next.js on Pages, then they moved it to Open Next.js for Cloudflare, which is using Next.js on Cloudflare workers. It's pretty good, but still a little bit of a pain. They're literally just monkey patching the Next.js Webpack output, which is that's a whole thing. And then I moved to Waku, which is multiple Vite builds, and now we have this Redwood, which is, I'm assuming it's using the environment API in Vite, which is new, to do both server and client Vite.
Dope.
Pretty sweet. Yes.
Yeah. The last one that we're going to be talking about today is that Storybook 9 entered beta in April 24th. And we started using Storybook on the new Syntax site, which Storybook is interesting because it does everything in an iframe. If your components rely...
Can you explain what Storybook is for real quick for anyone who hasn't heard it?
Storybook is a place to develop your components in isolation, which allows you to essentially render an individual or even like chain of components and then pass in mocked data, and therefore you can build your component in a little sandbox where you can make sure that this thing will fit all the specifications, and then you can change it with different data, see how it reacts, longer titles, longer this, change the image, all that stuff, and you can build out your entire component library outside of the bigger application, so that way when you dump your stuff in the bigger application, you're playing with Legos, right? Which is a great way, because sometimes when we're working in a bigger project or a project in general, we can build things that are really like tightly coupled, one, but two like
tightly coupled.
Yeah, possibly be relying on stuff outside of here or stuff outside of here, and you might not recognize it until you're trying to use these things more flexibly. So flexibly, flex, I don't even know if that's a word, with Flex. Yeah, so Storybook 9 has a number of really enticing updates. So I'll be updating to this because I'm a beta user all the time. But what does this add? It adds component test. What is component test widget? I don't even know what that is. It adds interaction testing, accessibility testing, visual testing, test coverage in general. It's a 48% lighter bundle, tag-based organization, and React Native support. So, the testing widget is basically one that lets you run your test. It's a widget for running tests. But the thing I like most about this testing feature, so you can have your integration tests inside of Storybook now in a visual manner a la Cypress, or was it Playwright is the other one?
Yeah. Playwright. So Playwright is like both like a headless browser like Puppeteer, but then it also has some utilities for running your tests, either headful or headless.
Yes. Okay. So we have that. We have accessibility testing, which is a perfect fit for something like this. It now will complain about accessibility issues within your components, which gotta love that. Anything we can, especially when you're there building, right? It's always great to, one thing I really like about the Polypane browser is it's just there when you're building. So to have this here when you're building, if you're building in Storybook, Really nice. Visual testing. You can now visual regression test to make sure that your components don't get, like, let's say I change some global CSS here and it now affects a component here in a negative way. You're going to be alerted to that with a visual regression test. I got to say, visual regression testing is one of those things that I've always looked at as being way more pain than it's worth. But if you can have it within isolation, to me that makes so much more sense, because you have a page, you have an individual component, whatever, on a page, all of those things change all the time, right? But when you have these things in micro isolation with sandbox data or with mocked data, it shouldn't change unless you know it's going to change. So the fact that you have so much control over all the information coming in and all that stuff means that, like, I now could be confident if this is visually saying, hey, something goofed up here, that it's actually worth my time. So visual regression testing, I've never been a fan. I'm going to use it. I'm going to straight up use it. Yeah.
That's nicer to do, I think, at a component level than... Like in the past, I've used it on like an entire page. And there's just so many things that could possibly nudge it left or right, little browser quirks or a little piece of text that is longer than the other. And it is just like too much of a pain, too many like false positives, right? But I could imagine as part of your like component test, right? Your components should not change anything about how they look unless you explicitly approve that. So I think that's great.
Yeah, I'm going to use it. I've never thought I would say I would use visual regression testing, but we will add it. There's also a test coverage screen now, so you can see which components are tested and how much of these components have test coverage. Test coverage to me is one of those things that it's nice to have, but like, I don't know if I need it, but it's nice to have. I think one of the coolest things about this update for me is this 48% lighter, but it's not just that it's smaller in size. They have an image, and we're sharing our screen here, of the dependency graph before and after. And some of this has just been like a result of the ecosystem building packages that reference packages, etc., until you're using an is even package somewhere. And there's been a bit of a resurgence in like using packages that have no dependencies or small dependency graphs. And I gotta say, if you're comparing these two dependency graphs that I'm showing on the screen right now, nothing makes me happier than this. I am a spring cleaning kind of guy. I love picking up the stuff and putting it in where it should go. And look at this and look at that. Yeah.
I want to know what they actually did, though. Like,
there's a bit of a thread on Twitter. I think some of it is just replacing common packages that had many dependencies with packages that, again, are primarily built to be a single dependency package.
Did they just bundle it into a single package?
There's been a huge push for that in the Svelte ecosystem as well, where they've been like rewriting common packages to use no dependencies. So there has been a bit of a push in
do
my
exactly
ecosystem.
What you want as well.
Yeah. Lastly here, well, not lastly, there's two more things. The tag-based organization, you can now tag your stuff and filter by those tags, just a quality of life thing. And then React Native support. Cool. I'm not using React Native, but happy these folks have React Native support inside of Storybook. So shout out to all the teams releasing cool stuff. This is all great. I have nothing to complain about here. I think if the thing I complain about the most is naming of React APIs, then that's pretty good. I'm going to do that anyway. So yeah,
that's great. Awesome. Yeah. Tons of stuff, tons of new updates. We haven't really done like a news show very often, but it feels like just the updates just keep on coming. And it's fun to be able to talk about what's been going on. Let us know down below in the comments if you have any thoughts on any of this stuff, if you're going to be using any of it, especially the React server components. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. We'll catch you in the next one.
Peace.